The steel door slammed shut behind her with a sound that echoed through every bone in her body. Carmen Reyes didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Just stood there in her orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed in front of her, staring down the intake officer with eyes that had stopped crying 3 months ago. The officer, a woman named Henderson who'd processed 10,000 inmates in 15 years, felt something cold crawl up her spine. This one was different. Not angry. Not scared. Just empty. Like someone had scooped out everything human and left behind something that knew how to wait. "You understand where you are?" Henderson asked, already knowing the answer. Riverside Women's Correctional. Maximum security. 25 to life. Carmen's voice was flat. Professional. Like she was reading ingredients off a cereal box. "You understand what that means for someone like you? Someone who killed the 2 men who murdered my son?" Carmen interrupted, her eyes finally showing something. Not rage. Not grief. Just a flicker of acknowledgement. "Yes, Officer Henderson. I understand perfectly." What Henderson didn't understand, what nobody in that prison could possibly know, was that Carmen Reyes had been a CIA interrogator for 11 years. That she'd broken foreign agents, terrorist cells, and trained soldiers without ever raising her voice. That she understood human psychology the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Every pressure point. Every weakness. Every way to take someone apart without them realizing what was happening until it was far too late. And Henderson definitely didn't know that Carmen hadn't come to Riverside to serve time. She came to finish what those 2 dead men had started when they killed her 15-year-old son, Miguel, during a gang initiation that went wrong. Because the real architect of Miguel's death wasn't lying in the morgue. She was sitting in cell block C, serving life without parole, running the entire prison like her personal kingdom. Lucia La Serpiente Vargas. The woman who gave the order. The woman whose gang controlled the streets where Miguel died. The woman who'd laughed when she heard what happened to the kid who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tonight, at 11:47, when the guards changed shifts and the cameras in the West Corridor went into their maintenance cycle, Carmen was going to meet Lucia for the first time. And by tomorrow morning, everyone in Riverside would understand that monsters come in all shapes. Some wear gang colors. Some wear orange jumpsuits. And some wear the face of a grieving mother who'd spent 3 months planning the perfect way to destroy the woman who took her only reason for living. "Stay with me until the end," Carmen whispered as Henderson led her toward cell block C, "because what happens in this place won't be justice. It'll be something far more elegant than that." 6 months earlier, Carmen Reyes had been someone completely different. She taught ESL classes at Roosevelt High School 3 days a week. She drove Miguel to soccer practice every Tuesday and Thursday. She made dinner at 6, helped with homework at 7, and fell asleep most nights watching terrible reality TV shows while her son complained about how fake everything was. The transition from CIA to civilian life had taken 4 years of therapy, 2 failed relationships, and a complete geographical relocation from Washington, D.C. to a quiet neighborhood in Phoenix. Carmen had done things in dark rooms overseas that she would spend the rest of her life trying to forget. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to separate the woman who broke people from the woman who raised a beautiful, kind son who wanted to be a pediatrician. Miguel was her redemption. Every smile, every good grade, every moment of teenage rebellion was proof that she could create something good despite everything she'd done in service of national security. She'd walked away from that life believing that love could outweigh violence. That being a good mother could somehow balance the scales of all the harm she'd caused. But the universe doesn't care about balance. It only cares about chaos. The call came at 9:47 on a Friday night. Miguel was supposed to be studying at his friend David's house. He was supposed to be safe. He was supposed to be memorizing biology terms for Monday's test. Instead, he was lying on a street corner in South Phoenix with 3 bullets in his chest because the Los Diablos gang had decided that particular intersection needed to be claimed with blood, and Miguel happened to be walking home at exactly the wrong moment. Carmen arrived at the hospital at 10:23. Miguel died at 10:31. She held his hand as the machines flatlined, as nurses gently tried to pull her away, as her entire world collapsed into a single moment of absolute silence. Something fundamental broke inside her that night. Not her mind, that stayed sharp, focused, clinical. What broke was the thin membrane that separated Carmen the teacher from Carmen the interrogator. The woman who'd learned to smile at parent-teacher conferences and the woman who'd once made a Taliban commander reveal the location of a terror cell using nothing but psychological pressure and 12 hours in a windowless room. They became one person. And that person was very, very dangerous. The police investigation moved like molasses. 2 detectives, Thompson and Garcia, did their best, but gang-related shootings in South Phoenix were epidemic. They had leads, witnesses who saw nothing, evidence that led nowhere. They explained to Carmen with practiced sympathy that these cases were difficult, that justice took time, that they would do everything possible to find Miguel's killers. Carmen gave them 2 weeks. Then she started her own investigation. What the police didn't know was that Carmen still had access to databases, contacts, and surveillance systems that technically she shouldn't be able to touch. A decade in intelligence meant favors owed, back doors that stayed open, and friends and agencies that didn't officially exist. She identified the shooters in 72 hours. Rafael Flaco Martinez, 19 years old, 3 priors, Los Diablos foot soldier. Tommy Chen, 17, first arrest, trying to earn his colors. And she found something else. Something that changed everything. The hit wasn't random. Miguel had been targeted. Not because of anything he'd done, but because of who Carmen used to be. 10 years earlier, during an operation in El Pozo, Carmen had interrogated a cartel lieutenant named Victor Vargas. That interrogation had led to 43 arrests, including Victor's wife, Lucia, who'd been running the financial operations. Victor had died in federal custody under suspicious circumstances. Lucia had gone to prison swearing revenge. Lucia La Serpiente Vargas had spent 8 years in Riverside Women's Correctional building an empire from behind bars. She controlled drug distribution in 3 states, ran protection rackets in 6 prisons, and had connections that reached from maximum security cells to the highest levels of organized crime. And she'd never forgotten the woman who put her there. The hit on Miguel hadn't been gang business. It had been personal. A message written in the blood of an innocent kid who'd only wanted to help people. Carmen spent 3 days sitting in her empty house, surrounded by Miguel's soccer trophies and unfinished homework, methodically dismantling her entire emotional landscape and reconstructing it around a single purpose. Flaco and Tommy were easy. They were street-level thugs with predictable patterns and minimal protection. Carmen found Flaco at his girlfriend's apartment. She'd learned in the CIA that the most effective tools aren't weapons, they're opportunities. She created circumstances where Flaco's own paranoia, drug use, and violent tendencies led to a confrontation with a rival gang member that ended exactly as she'd calculated. Tommy Chen lasted longer, but only because Carmen needed information first. She'd spent her career extracting truth from people who'd been trained to resist, and Tommy was just a scared kid trying to act tough. It took 4 hours in an abandoned warehouse. And by the end, Tommy had told her everything. How Lucia had ordered the hit from prison. How she'd specifically requested that Carmen's son be the target. How she'd laughed when she heard that Miguel had begged for his life. When it was over, Tommy Chen disappeared. Not dead, Carmen had moved past simple violence. She'd arranged for him to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when federal agents raided a Los Diablos safe house. He'd spend the rest of his youth in juvenile detention, living with the knowledge of what he'd done. But that left Lucia Vargas. The architect. The monster who ordered the death of a child to satisfy a decade-old grudge. Lucia was untouchable behind prison walls, protected by a network of loyal inmates and corrupt guards, serving life without the possibility of parole. No amount of planning could get Carmen past the security checkpoints, the metal detectors, the layers of protection that surrounded high-risk inmates. That's when Carmen made the decision that would define everything that followed. She couldn't get to Lucia on the outside. So she would have to get to her on the inside. The plan Carmen devised was breathtaking in its precision. She would commit a crime serious enough to guarantee placement in Riverside. She would ensure that she ended up in cell block C, where Lucia ruled. And then she would dismantle everything Lucia had built before destroying the woman herself. But it had to be perfect. Too minor a crime and she'd end up in minimum security. Too severe and she'd be isolated from the general population. The crime had to demonstrate capability without suggesting premeditation, strength without instability. Carmen spent 2 weeks studying Riverside's intake procedures, security protocols, and housing assignments. She learned about guard rotations, inmate hierarchies, and the unwritten rules that govern life behind bars. Most importantly, she identified exactly where Lucia Vargas spent her time and which inmates had access to her inner circle. The armed robbery that Carmen staged was a masterpiece. She targeted a bank affiliated with Los Diablos money laundering, disabled security with non-lethal precision, and stole enough cash to guarantee a serious sentence while leaving behind just enough evidence to ensure quick apprehension. To the FBI task force that arrested her 4 days later, she looked like a grieving mother who'd snapped and made desperate mistakes. The psychological evaluation classified her as suffering from acute trauma-induced break from reality, nonviolent despite the armed robbery, suitable for general population with monitoring. Everything went according to plan. Until Carmen walked into cell block C and saw Lucia Vargas for the first time in 10 years. Lucia had aged, but prison had made her harder, sharper, more dangerous than the cartel wife Carmen remembered. She sat in the common area like a queen holding court, surrounded by a carefully chosen inner circle of enforcers and associates. When Lucia saw Carmen, recognition flickered across her face, followed by a smile that made several nearby inmates unconsciously step backward. Well, Lucia said, her voice carrying across the crowded room. Carmen Reyes. The woman who destroyed my family. Welcome to my home. That first night, lying on a thin mattress in cell 47, Carmen stared at the ceiling and mentally reviewed everything she'd learned in her first 8 hours inside Riverside. She'd been right about one thing: Lucia controlled cell block C with absolute authority. What she hadn't anticipated was how sophisticated that control had become. Lucia didn't rule through simple violence or intimidation. She created a complex system of debts, favors, and dependencies that made her indispensable to nearly everyone in the block. She protected vulnerable inmates from predators in exchange for loyalty. She provided contraband and comfort items through networks that bypassed official channels. She settled disputes with the wisdom of someone who understood that maintaining peace was more profitable than encouraging chaos. Most dangerously, Lucia had cultivated relationships with 3 guards who were willing to look the other way, or actively assist, in exchange for shares of her underground economy. Carmen had faced many intelligent opponents in her career, but Lucia Vargas was proving to be something special. A born strategist who'd spent 8 years perfecting her craft in an environment that rewarded patience and punished mistakes. This wasn't going to be simple. But then again, Carmen hadn't expected simple. She'd expected a challenge worthy of everything she'd learned in 11 years of breaking people who thought they were unbreakable. The attack came on her 3rd day, and it was precisely what Carmen had been waiting for. She was returning from the library when 4 women cornered her in the corridor between the education wing and the cell blocks. They moved with practiced coordination, 1 blocking her path forward, 2 moving in from the sides, 1 covering the rear. No weapons visible, but Carmen's trained eye caught the subtle bulges that indicated improvised shanks hidden in waistbands. These were Lucia's people. Not her best, those would be saved for more important work, but competent enough to send a message to a new inmate who needed to understand the hierarchy. What they didn't understand was that Carmen had been trained to face multiple opponents in confined spaces. The CIA didn't just teach interrogation. They taught survival in hostile environments where backup was hours away and failure meant capture or death. The first woman reached for Carmen's shoulder, probably intending to slam her against the wall while the others moved in. Carmen caught the wrist in a grip that looked gentle but hit nerve clusters that made the woman's entire arm go numb. She used the momentum to pivot, placing the now disabled attacker between herself and the woman approaching from the left. The second attacker hesitated, not wanting to hurt her associate. That hesitation cost her the initiative. Carmen released the first woman, who crumpled to the floor, and flowed into the space between the remaining 3 like water finding cracks in stone. What happened next lasted 41 seconds. When it was over, 4 women were on the ground, conscious but unable to move, nerve clusters temporarily paralyzed by precise applications of pressure that would leave no visible marks but would take hours to fully recover from. Carmen stood in the center of the corridor, breathing normally, not a hair out of place. She looked down at the women with something that might have been sympathy. "Tell Lucia that I didn't come here to fight," she said quietly. "Tell her I came here to talk. And tell her that the next time she sends amateurs to test me, I'll be disappointed." When the guards arrived 3 minutes later, they found 5 women in the corridor. 4 on the ground claiming they'd slipped, and Carmen standing calmly against the wall, hands visible, expression neutral. The security footage showed exactly what she'd known it would show: a new inmate defending herself against an unprovoked attack with remarkable efficiency. By dinner time, everyone in cell block C knew two things: the new woman in 47 was more dangerous than she looked, and Lucia Vargas had seriously underestimated her opponent. The game had begun. Lucia received the news in her cell with the kind of controlled fury that had kept her alive in the cartel business for 2 decades. She understood now that Carmen hadn't come to Riverside by accident. This was a hunt, and somehow, impossibly, Lucia had become the prey. But La Serpiente hadn't survived 8 years in maximum security by being predictable. Over the next week, Carmen watched Lucia's power structure with the analytical precision of someone trained to identify vulnerabilities in complex systems. Every organization, no matter how well designed, had pressure points. The key was finding them and applying force at exactly the right moment. Lucia's empire rested on 3 pillars: Officer Jessica Torres, a 10-year veteran who controlled contraband flow into cell block C for a percentage of the profits; Maya "Ghost" Johnson, Lucia's primary enforcer, a woman serving life for murder who'd perfected the art of violence without leaving evidence; and Chen Wei, who ran the commissary allocation system and could make inmates' lives comfortable or miserable depending on Lucia's instructions. Carmen needed to understand each of them before she could begin dismantling the structure. She started with Torres. The guard was 34, divorced, supporting 2 kids on a correctional officer's salary while dealing with chronic back pain from a car accident 3 years earlier. Carmen had learned in the CIA that the most effective recruitment wasn't about money or threats, it was about becoming useful. During her second week, Carmen noticed Torres grimacing during her rounds, one hand pressed to her lower back. "Sciatic nerve compression," Carmen said casually as Torres passed her cell. "The way you're favoring your right side suggests the L4-L5 vertebrae. I used to work with field medics. There are pressure point techniques that can help, if you're interested." Torres stopped, suspicious but intrigued. "You a doctor?" "No, but I spent time in places where medical care wasn't readily available. You learn to manage pain with what you have." It started with small conversations about physical therapy and pain management. Carmen was careful to never mention Torres's arrangement with Lucia, never suggest anything improper. She simply made herself useful, sharing techniques that genuinely helped with the chronic pain. 3 weeks later, when Torres needed someone to help reorganize the library inventory, a task that came with access to supply closets and administrative schedules, she asked Carmen. While Carmen worked on Maya "Ghost" Johnson, she took a different approach. Ghost was pure predator, loyal to Lucia because the arrangement benefited her. She enjoyed her role as enforcer, took pride in her reputation for surgical violence. Carmen had dealt with this personality type before. They couldn't be recruited or reasoned with. They could only be redirected. Carmen began attending the prison's creative writing workshop, a program that Ghost also attended for reasons that became clear during the first session. Ghost was writing a memoir, and she was surprisingly talented. The violence in her past had given her stories that, properly told, could be publishable. "You're burying your best material in exposition," Carmen commented after reading one of Ghost's pieces during a workshop session. "The childhood trauma in Chapter 3, that's your emotional core. But you're telling instead of showing." Ghost stared at her with flat eyes that had witnessed, and caused, terrible things. "You know about writing? I taught English for 4 years. I know about structure, pacing, and how to make readers care about people they should fear." Over the following weeks, Carmen became Ghost's informal editor. She never mentioned Lucia, never suggested any disloyalty. She simply helped Ghost craft her story, subtly emphasizing themes of independence, self-determination, and the dangers of being someone else's weapon. The third pillar, Chen Wei, proved most challenging. Chen was motivated purely by profit. She'd been a white-collar criminal on the outside, embezzling from her company's pension fund. Prison hadn't reformed her, it had simply given her a new market to exploit. Carmen couldn't offer Chen money. But she could offer something more valuable: information. "I used to work in financial analysis," Carmen lied smoothly during a conversation in the commissary. "Derivatives, mostly. Boring stuff, but I learned to see patterns in market movements." Chen's interest sharpened. "What kind of patterns?" "The kind that predict shifts before they happen. I know you have investment accounts on the outside, everyone does something with their money. I could give you insights on what's moving and why. It was a delicate dance. Carmen fed Chen legitimate financial analysis based on market trends she'd learned during her CIA work analyzing terrorist funding networks. The information was accurate, valuable, and positioned Carmen as someone useful beyond Lucia's shadow. While Carmen built her network, Lucia was dealing with a different problem: paranoia. For 8 years, she'd been the apex predator. Now she found herself constantly watching her back, wondering when Carmen would make her real move. Lucia's paranoia began to show in small ways. She started varying her routines. Her meetings became shorter and more secretive. She began testing the loyalty of her inner circle with increasingly elaborate tests. And she made the critical mistake of showing fear to people who'd followed her because she seemed invincible. That's when Carmen made her first real move against Lucia's power structure. It started with a letter. Carmen had learned from Torres's casual conversation that Lucia's lieutenant, a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, had a sister on the outside who was struggling with immigration issues. Carmen used her old CIA contacts, carefully, discreetly, to help resolve those issues. Not obviously, not in a way that could be traced back to her, but enough that Rosa received a letter from her sister explaining that someone anonymous had helped her navigate the legal system. Rosa asked questions. Quietly, carefully, she tried to determine who might have been responsible for her sister's sudden good fortune. And eventually, through a carefully orchestrated series of conversations, she learned that Carmen Reyes had contacts that could do things Lucia's street networks couldn't touch. Loyalty, Carmen had learned over a decade in intelligence, was always conditional. It lasted only as long as the benefits outweighed the costs. The second incident was more personal to Lucia's sense of control. Maya Ghost Johnson received a letter from a literary agent who'd somehow obtained her manuscript. The agent was interested, preliminary interested, in representing Ghost for publication. The news spread through Cell Block C like wildfire. Lucia's feared enforcer suddenly had something more valuable than her reputation for violence, a potential future beyond prison walls. Ghost didn't leave Lucia's service, but the dynamic had shifted. She was no longer a weapon who defined herself entirely through violence. She was a writer who happened to be serving time for past crimes. And writers think about legacy, about how their stories will be remembered. They think about redemption. By the end of Carmen's 4th week, Lucia's power structure hadn't crumbled, but it had developed subtle cracks that would widen with time and pressure. More importantly, Carmen had established herself as something more dangerous than a rival power broker. She'd become a force that operated by different rules than anyone else in Cell Block C. She didn't need muscle or territory or traditional displays of dominance. She simply existed in the spaces between official authority and inmate hierarchy, making herself useful to people while subtly undermining Lucia's foundation. But Carmen knew that the real confrontation was still ahead. Lucia Vargas wasn't going to surrender her position without a fight, and that fight would require Carmen to demonstrate something she'd been carefully hiding since her arrival. Not her capacity for violence, that had been demonstrated on her 3rd day. Something far more devastating: her capacity for psychological warfare perfected over 11 years of making enemies of the United States reveal their deepest secrets. The confrontation came during the weekly group therapy session. Dr. Rebecca Martinez ran these sessions every Thursday afternoon, and attendance was mandatory for inmates categorized as needing psychological support. Carmen had been placed in the program due to her psych evaluation. Lucia attended because maintaining the appearance of rehabilitation was part of her long-term strategy. They'd avoided direct interaction for 5 weeks. Now they sat in a circle of folding chairs with 12 other women, and Dr. Martinez was discussing the topic of grief and loss. "Carmen," Dr. Martinez said gently, "you've been very quiet since you arrived. Would you like to share about your son?" The room went silent. Everyone knew Carmen's story. In prison, everyone knew everything. But hearing her actually speak about Miguel was different. "My son was 15 years old," Carmen began, her voice steady but hollow. "His name was Miguel. He wanted to be a pediatrician. He was funny, kind, and he died on a street corner because someone decided his life was worth less than a gang's need to claim territory." Lucia shifted in her chair, but her expression remained neutral. "He begged for his life," Carmen continued, her eyes now locked directly on Lucia. "That's what the shooter told me before I made sure he'd spend the rest of his youth in prison. Miguel begged, and they shot him anyway. 3 bullets. Because someone, somewhere, had decided that killing an innocent child was an acceptable way to settle a grudge. "Carmen," Dr. Martinez said, sensing the tension building in the room, "this is a safe space. We are here to process grief, not. But here's what's interesting about grief," Carmen interrupted, her voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space. "In my old job, I learned that grief can be transformed. Not healed, not resolved, but transformed into something more useful than pain." She stood up slowly, and half the women in the circle tensed, expecting violence. But Carmen simply walked to the center of the circle, her movements calm and deliberate. "I learned that the human mind is incredibly fragile under the right conditions. That even the strongest person has pressure points that, when properly identified and manipulated, can cause complete psychological collapse without ever touching them physically." Lucia's mask finally cracked, just slightly. A flicker of fear crossed her face. "I learned that power isn't about who can inflict the most violence," Carmen continued. "It's about who understands systems well enough to dismantle them piece by piece until the person at the top realizes they're standing on nothing but air." "This is inappropriate," Dr. Martinez said, standing up. "Carmen, sit down." "In a moment, doctor. I'm almost finished." Carmen turned back to Lucia. "The shooters who killed Miguel told me everything. How the order came from you. How you specifically requested that my son be the target. How you laughed when you heard what happened." "I don't know what you're talking about," Lucia said, but her voice had lost its commanding presence. "Don't you?" Carmen smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing anyone in that room had ever seen. "Shall I tell everyone here about your brother? About how he died in federal custody after I spent 12 hours extracting information from him?" The room erupted in whispered conversations. This was information that had never been public, connections that existed in sealed files and classified reports. "Shall I tell them about the tumor you're hiding?" Carmen continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "The one your doctor mentioned in your medical records that Torres accidentally left in the library? How it's growing, how the prison medical system is too slow to treat it properly, how you lie awake at night wondering if you'll die in here without ever seeing the outside again." Lucia's face had gone pale. Her hands were shaking. 8 years of carefully constructed power and control were crumbling in real time as Carmen exposed vulnerabilities that Lucia had kept hidden even from her closest associates. "You came here to kill me," Lucia whispered. "No," Carmen said quietly. "I came here to show you what it feels like to lose everything that matters. You took my son. So I'm taking your power, your dignity, and your peace of mind. One piece at a time. Until you understand exactly what you destroyed when you ordered Miguel's death." Dr. Martinez was calling for guards, but Carmen wasn't finished. "By tomorrow morning, everyone in this prison will know about your medical condition. Your people will start wondering if you're strong enough to protect them. The guards you've bought will start thinking about what happens when you're gone. And you'll spend every remaining day of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when I'll finally decide that you've suffered enough." The guards arrived and escorted Carmen from the room. But the damage was done. Lucia sat in her chair, surrounded by women who were seeing her differently now, not as La Serpiente, the untouchable queen of Cell Block C, but as a sick, frightened woman who'd made an enemy far more dangerous than any gang rival. That night, Lucia didn't sleep. She lay in her cell, mind racing through possibilities and defenses that no longer seemed adequate. For 30 years, she'd survived by being 3 steps ahead of her opponents. But Carmen operated by rules that made traditional criminal thinking useless. Over the next 72 hours, Lucia watched her carefully constructed empire begin to disintegrate. Rosa Gutierrez, whose sister had been helped by Carmen's mysterious contacts, became less responsive to orders. Maya Johnson, focused on her memoir and potential literary career, started questioning whether continued violence served her interests. Chen Wei, receiving valuable financial insights from Carmen, began to wonder if diversifying her loyalties might be profitable. Most devastatingly, the other inmates in Cell Block C began to watch Lucia differently. She'd ruled through an image of invincibility, but Carmen had revealed the frightened, sick woman behind the mask. Power in prison is ephemeral, it exists only as long as people believe in it. Carmen had shattered that belief in a single therapy session. But Lucia Vargas hadn't survived 3 decades in organized crime by being passive. If she couldn't maintain power through perception, she would have to maintain it through force. The decision to arm herself came easier than it should have. Miguel Santos, the prison's premier weapon crafter, owed Lucia favors that couldn't be refused. The shank he provided was 8 inches of sharpened steel wrapped in electrical tape, designed to penetrate clothing and flesh with minimal resistance. Lucia wasn't a fighter. Her violence had always been administrative, ordered from positions of safety. But desperation makes people attempt things they never thought possible. The plan was direct. During recreation time in the yard, when guards were spread thin and inmates clustered in groups, Lucia would approach Carmen and end the threat with a single strike. What Lucia didn't understand was that Carmen had been trained by the CIA to anticipate exactly this kind of desperate response. The yard at Riverside held 200 women during recreation period. Concrete basketball courts, weight equipment, and walking tracks arranged in a space surrounded by 30-foot walls and guard towers. It was controlled chaos, a carefully managed environment where potential violence simmered constantly beneath institutional routine. Carmen entered the yard at exactly 2:15, her routine unchanged despite the escalating tension with Lucia. She'd been working out with a group of women who appreciated her quiet strength and knowledge of proper technique. She positioned herself at the weight bench in the center of the yard, not hidden, not protected, but completely visible to everyone including the guard towers. Lucia appeared 20 minutes later, moving through the crowd with forced casualness. The shank was concealed in her waistband, hidden beneath an oversized sweatshirt. Her eyes were fixed on Carmen's back as she navigated between clusters of inmates. 30 feet. 20. 10. At 5 feet, Carmen turned around. She moved with practiced efficiency, not dramatically but with the economy of motion that comes from years of training. Her left hand caught Lucia's wrist before the blade cleared her sweatband, applying pressure to nerve clusters that made Lucia's fingers spasm open. The shank clattered to the concrete. Carmen's right hand moved to Lucia's solar plexus, not striking, just positioning, in a way that communicated absolute control. "Lucia," Carmen said quietly, her voice carrying only to the women immediately around them. "This isn't how this ends." The entire yard had gone silent. 200 inmates and a dozen guards watched as Carmen held Lucia in a grip that looked almost gentle but left the former gang queen completely helpless. "You killed my son," Carmen continued, her voice steady and clear. "You ordered his death because you wanted to hurt me, because your rage over your husband's choices needed an outlet, and a 15-year-old boy seemed like acceptable collateral damage." Dr. Martinez, who happened to be in the yard for her weekly observations, stood frozen near the fence, her professional training warring with fascination at the psychological dynamics unfolding. "But here's what you never understood about me, Lucia. In my old work, I learned that revenge isn't about making your enemy suffer. It's about making them understand. Really, truly understand what they've done." Carmen's voice dropped, but somehow it carried to every corner of the silent yard. "For the past 6 weeks, I've been dismantling your power structure. Rosa isn't loyal anymore. Maya is thinking about her future beyond these walls. Chen has diversified her interests. Torres respects me more than she fears you. Every pillar you built your empire on has cracks in it now." Lucia's eyes were wide with fear and fury, her body trembling. "But that's not the real punishment," Carmen said. "The real punishment is that I'm going to let you live. You're going to watch as everything you built over 8 years continues to crumble. You're going to spend every day wondering if today is the day I decide to finish this. You're going to lie awake at night remembering what you did to my son and knowing that his mother is somewhere in this prison, waiting." "Why?" Lucia managed to whisper. "Why not just kill me?" "Because death is easy," Carmen replied. "Death is escape. What you deserve is something much harder, living with the consequences of your choices, knowing that the woman whose child you murdered is smarter, more patient, and more dangerous than you could ever hope to be." Carmen released Lucia's wrist and stepped backward, leaving the former gang queen standing alone in the center of the yard with 200 witnesses to her complete humiliation. "Everyone here needs to understand something," Carmen said, addressing the entire yard now. "Lucia Vargas ordered the death of a child. Not for business. Not for territory. But for personal revenge. That makes her something worse than a criminal. It makes her someone who can't be trusted. Someone who operates without any code except her own ego." The silence stretched across the yard like breaking glass. "I could have killed her 20 different ways over the past 6 weeks," Carmen continued. But that wouldn't bring Miguel back. That wouldn't balance anything. So instead, I'm giving all of you information. Lucia has a brain tumor that's growing. Her medical treatment is being delayed by prison bureaucracy. Her power was built on perception, and that perception is broken now. What you do with this information is your choice. Carmen turned and walked toward the entrance, leaving the shank on the ground next to Lucia. There's your weapon, Lucia. You wanted to end this with violence. But I'm walking away. And you have to decide, do you pick up that blade and prove you're nothing but a desperate woman clinging to the illusion of power? Or do you accept that you've already lost? For a long moment, Lucia stared at the shank. Her hand twitched toward it. Every instinct screamed at her to grab the weapon, to salvage some scrap of dignity through violence. But 200 pairs of eyes were watching. And reaching for that blade would prove everything Carmen had said, that Lucia was desperate, frightened, powerless. The former gang queen turned and walked away, leaving the weapon on the concrete. The entire yard erupted in conversation the moment she disappeared through the doorway. Guards rushed to secure the shank and restore order, but the real damage was already done. Carmen had achieved something unprecedented. She'd destroyed Lucia's power without violence, revealed her vulnerabilities without malice, and turned the entire prison population into witnesses of a queen's fall from grace. By evening count, every inmate in Riverside knew the story. Lucia Vargas, La Serpiente, the woman who'd controlled cell block C with absolute authority, had been publicly humiliated by a new arrival who operated by rules that made traditional prison politics obsolete. But Carmen wasn't celebrating. She lay in her cell that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Miguel. About his laugh and his dreams and the way he'd looked at her with such love and trust right before he left the house for the last time. She'd achieved her goal. Lucia's empire was crumbling. Her reputation was destroyed. She would spend whatever time she had left in prison looking over her shoulder, isolated and afraid. But Miguel was still gone. And no amount of perfect revenge could bring him back. That's when Carmen understood the true cost of what she'd done. She'd transformed her grief into a weapon, her pain into strategy, her love for her son into systematic destruction of the woman responsible for his death. She'd become precisely the kind of person she'd spent her CIA career trying to move beyond. The victory felt hollow. Complete, satisfying in a technical sense, but ultimately empty. Because revenge, no matter how perfectly executed, doesn't heal wounds. It just creates new ones in different hearts. The weeks following the yard incident were strange for Carmen. Lucia had effectively disappeared from cell block C's social structure. She stayed in her cell most of the time, attended mandatory meals and activities, but the aura of power that had defined her was gone. Other inmates gave her space not out of respect but out of something closer to pity. Carmen, by contrast, found herself in an uncomfortable position. Women approached her with problems, disputes, questions about how to navigate prison life. Not because she'd sought leadership, but because she'd demonstrated something that commanded respect, the ability to dismantle a power structure through intelligence rather than violence. I didn't come here to be someone's queen, Carmen told Dr. Martinez during one of their therapy sessions. Then why did you come here? Dr. Martinez asked, her professional curiosity tempered by genuine concern for this complicated woman. I came here because the legal system couldn't give me justice. Because the woman who ordered my son's death was protected by walls and guards and a lifetime sentence that made her untouchable from the outside. And now? Now I'm realizing that justice and revenge might look similar from a distance, but they are fundamentally different things. Justice restores balance. Revenge just shifts pain from one person to another. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. You accomplished what you came here to do. You destroyed Lucia's power, exposed her vulnerabilities, and ensured she'll spend her remaining time in prison without the protection she built. But you're not satisfied. My son is still dead, Carmen said quietly. Nothing I do here changes that. I thought that making Lucia suffer would somehow make my grief more bearable. But it doesn't. It just reminds me that I've become someone Miguel wouldn't recognize. The transformation had been subtle but profound. Carmen had entered Riverside as a grieving mother driven by rage and loss. Over 2 months inside, she'd reconnected with skills and instincts she'd spent years trying to bury. The CIA operative, the interrogator, the woman who understood human psychology well enough to break people without touching them. That person had emerged from where Carmen had hidden her. And now she couldn't figure out how to put that part of herself back in the box. The incident that changed everything happened during evening meal service. A young woman named Jessica, 22 years old, serving 5 years for drug possession, was cornered by 3 inmates who decided her commissary money would be better spent on their needs than hers. It was a routine occurrence in prison life. Predators identified vulnerable targets, and without intervention, those targets became permanent victims. Carmen watched from her usual table as Jessica tried to negotiate, her voice shaking, her body language screaming fear. The 3 women weren't interested in negotiation. One of them, a lifer named Brenda, reached for Jessica's collar. Carmen stood up. She didn't plan it, didn't calculate the strategic implications. She just moved, crossing the dining hall in 4 seconds, positioning herself between Jessica and the 3 predators. "She's not your target tonight," Carmen said quietly. Brenda was 6 feet tall, muscular, with a reputation for brutality that kept other inmates careful around her. She stared at Carmen with the flat expression of someone evaluating threat levels. "This doesn't concern you, teacher lady. Walk away." "I can't do that." "You really want to make this your problem?" Brenda asked, her 2 associates moving to flank Carmen. "Here's the thing about problems," Carmen said, her voice remaining conversational. "They're only problems if you don't have solutions. And I have solutions that you can't even imagine, Brenda. Ask Lucia Vargas about that sometime." The reference landed like a physical blow. Everyone in Riverside knew what had happened to Lucia. How she'd gone from queen to ghost in 6 weeks because she'd underestimated the quiet woman in cell 47. Brenda's calculation shifted. Was Jessica's commissary money worth making an enemy of someone who'd destroyed La Serpiente without ever throwing a punch? The 3 predators backed off. Jessica whispered thank you and hurried away. And Carmen realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. She'd come to Riverside to destroy one person who'd harmed the innocent. But there were dozens, hundreds of Lucias in the world. People who preyed on the vulnerable, who used power to inflict pain, who operated without consequences because systems couldn't or wouldn't stop them. Miguel was gone. Nothing would bring him back. But Carmen could prevent other Miguels, other innocents, from being destroyed by people like Lucia. That night, Carmen requested a meeting with Warden Catherine Hayes. Hayes had run Riverside for 12 years, and she'd developed a sense for inmates who were different from the general population. Carmen Reyes had been on her radar since the psychological evaluation revealed CIA background that had been heavily redacted. "Mrs. Reyes," Hayes said as Carmen entered her office. "You've been interesting since your arrival. I apologize for any disruption I've caused to the facility's operations," Carmen said. Hayes laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. "Disruption? You've actually made cell block C calmer. Violence is down. Incidents of predatory behavior have decreased. It's fascinating, really. Warden, I need to be honest with you about why I'm here." "I'm aware of why you're here, Mrs. Reyes. I read the classified portions of your file that required special clearance. Former CIA interrogator. 11 years in black operations. Highly skilled in psychological warfare and manipulation. Committed armed robbery with strategic incompetence to ensure placement in this facility near Lucia Vargas." Carmen's surprise must have shown because Hayes smiled. "I've been running prisons for a long time. I know the difference between someone who snaps under grief and someone executing a long-term plan. The question is, what happens now? You've achieved your goal. Lucia is broken. So why are you still here, metaphorically speaking?" "Because I realized something this evening. I came here for revenge, but there's something more useful I could do with the time I have left on my sentence." "Which is?" "Help you identify and disrupt predatory power structures before they become entrenched. You have women like Lucia in every cell block, people who use fear and violence to control others. I have skills that could make Riverside safer for everyone." Hayes studied Carmen with the kind of analytical assessment that reminded Carmen of her old CIA supervisors. "You're proposing to work as an informant?" "No. Informants work for personal benefit. I'm proposing to work as a consultant. Someone who understands how these systems operate from the inside and can help your staff prevent situations before they escalate." "And what do you get out of this?" "Purpose," Carmen said simply. "I can't bring my son back. But I can maybe prevent other mothers from losing their children to the kind of violence that flows from places like this into the outside world. The conversation lasted an hour. By the end, Hayes had authorized an unprecedented arrangement. Carmen would continue serving her sentence, but she would also work with prison administration to identify potential threats, mediate disputes, and help create interventions that made Riverside safer without increasing the prison's already overwhelming dependence on security measures. Over the next 6 months, something remarkable happened at Riverside Women's Correctional. Violence rates dropped 40%. The underground economy continued to exist, it always would, but the most exploitative elements were disrupted before they could become entrenched. New inmates found mentors instead of predators. And slowly, carefully, the institution began to function more like a place of rehabilitation than pure containment. Carmen became a paradox, an inmate who lived in cell 47 but operated more like a staff member without uniform. She attended therapy groups, mediated disputes, and used her understanding of human psychology to diffuse situations that might have exploded into violence. Dr. Martinez documented this transformation in her records, noting that Carmen had found a way to channel her grief into constructive purpose. Not healing, exactly, but transformation that served something beyond personal pain. And Lucia? Lucia spent her remaining time at Riverside in quiet obscurity. Her medical treatment eventually came through, too slowly, administered with the bureaucratic indifference that characterized prison healthcare, but sufficient to stabilize her condition. She lived, but she lived as a ghost of who she'd once been. 3 years after Carmen's arrival, Lucia was transferred to a minimum security medical facility for end-of-life care. The tumor had progressed, and prison officials made the humane decision to place her somewhere she could die with dignity. Before the transfer, Lucia requested a final meeting with Carmen. They met in a counseling room with a guard stationed outside. Lucia looked frail now, diminished by illness and the loss of everything that had defined her identity. "Why did you let me live?" Lucia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carmen considered the question carefully. "Because I realized that death would have been mercy. Living with the consequences of what you did, understanding that you destroyed an innocent child for nothing more than ego and revenge, that's the real punishment." "Do you regret it? What you did to me?" "No. But I regret what I became in the process. I turned my grief into a weapon, and weapons don't distinguish between justice and vengeance. They just destroy." Lucia nodded slowly. "Your son, Miguel. I want you to know that I think about him. About what I did. It doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry." Carmen studied the broken woman across from her. The apology was genuine, extracted not through manipulation or force but through years of isolation and reflection. "Thank you," Carmen said. "It doesn't bring him back. But it means something that you finally understand what you took from the world." They sat in silence for a moment, two women who'd destroyed each other in different ways, both trying to find meaning in the wreckage. "I heard what you've been doing here," Lucia said. "Helping people. Making this place less terrible. That's not revenge. That's something else. It's what I should have done from the beginning. Instead of becoming what you were, I should have been working to prevent people like you from existing in the first place." Lucia smiled, a sad, genuine expression that looked strange on her face. "You're a better person than I ever was, Carmen Reyes. I hope you find peace someday." "I hope you do too, Lucia." The former gang queen was transferred the next morning. She would die 6 weeks later in the medical facility, her passing noted in a brief administrative report. La Serpiente, who'd once controlled criminal operations across 3 states from a prison cell, died with only a nurse present. No mourners. No fanfare. Just the quiet end of someone who'd spent her life inflicting pain and died having finally understood its cost. Carmen received the news during dinner. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not grief. Just acknowledgement that a chapter had closed. That night, she wrote a letter to Miguel. She'd been writing to him since his death, filling notebooks with things she wished she could say to the son she'd never see grow up. "Dear Miguel. Today, the woman who ordered your death died. I thought I would feel something, closure, vindication, something. But I just feel tired. I came to this place to destroy her, and I did. But in the process, I learned something about myself that you probably already knew. I'm better at building than destroying. I'm better at helping than hurting. I'm better as your mother than as anyone's enemy. I can't change what happened to you. I can't bring you back or undo the grief that lives in my chest like broken glass. But I can try to make sure fewer mothers lose their sons. Fewer children become collateral damage in someone else's war. I hope that wherever you are, you understand why I did what I did. And I hope you can forgive me for becoming someone you might not recognize in order to achieve it. I love you. I will always love you. And I promise that the time I have left here will be spent honoring your memory by being the person you believed I was. Your mother, Carmen. Carmen's sentence concluded 4 years after her arrival at Riverside. By then, she'd helped implement programs that reduced recidivism, mentored dozens of women through their transitions back to civilian life, and created systems that made the prison function more humanely. Warden Hayes wrote a recommendation for early parole that emphasized Carmen's extraordinary contributions to institutional safety and rehabilitation. The parole board, reviewing her case, saw a woman who'd committed a serious crime under extreme psychological duress and had spent her incarceration becoming exactly the kind of reformed citizen the justice system claimed to create. Carmen was released on a Tuesday morning, processing out through the same doors where she'd entered 4 years earlier. Officer Torres, whose back pain had been managed through techniques Carmen taught her, was on duty for the departure. "What will you do now?" Torres asked. "I'm not sure," Carmen admitted. "Maybe go back to teaching. Maybe work with victims' advocacy groups. Maybe just figure out how to be normal again." "You were never normal, Carmen. You were always something more than that." Carmen smiled, a genuine expression that felt strange after so many years of calculated emotions. "Then I guess I'll figure out what more than normal looks like in the outside world." She walked through the gates of Riverside Women's Correctional at 9:47 a.m., 4 years to the day after Miguel's death. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. But as she stepped into the sunlight, breathing air that didn't taste of concrete and institutional disinfectant, Carmen realized something profound. Lucia Vargas was dead. Her own rage had burned itself out. Miguel was still gone, but his memory had been transformed from a wound into a compass, pointing toward purpose instead of vengeance. The most dangerous woman in Riverside had entered the prison system to destroy one person. But she'd left having built something that would outlast her incarceration: systems, relationships, and approaches that made the prison marginally less terrible for everyone who remained inside. Carmen Reyes had achieved her revenge. But more importantly, she'd found a way to transform her grief into something that honored her son's memory better than violence ever could. The story of what happened at Riverside would be told in whispered conversations for years. About the quiet woman who'd entered cell block C and dismantled a criminal empire without ever raising her fist. About La Serpiente's fall from power and redemption through suffering. About the teacher who became a warrior who became a healer without leaving prison. But the real story wasn't about revenge or justice or the creative application of psychological warfare. The real story was about a mother who'd lost everything and found a way to ensure that her son's death meant something beyond pain. About someone who'd become a monster to fight a monster and then found the strength to become human again. 6 months after her release, Carmen opened a youth center in South Phoenix. It provided after-school programs, tutoring, and safe spaces for kids in neighborhoods where violence was epidemic. She named it Miguel's Place and filled it with soccer trophies, science books, and hope. When someone asked her why she was doing this work, why she'd committed her life to helping kids who reminded her every day of what she'd lost, Carmen's answer was simple: because my son believed people were basically good. He believed that violence was a choice, not a destiny. And the best way I can honor his memory is by proving him right, one kid at a time. The most dangerous woman who'd ever walked through Riverside's gates had found her way back to being the teacher, the mentor, the mother that Miguel had believed she was all along. Not through forgetting what had happened. Not through erasing the skills and instincts that made her capable of perfect revenge. But through choosing, every single day, to be better than her worst impulses, stronger than her darkest grief, and more focused on building futures than destroying the past. In the end, Carmen Reyes proved something that most people never learn. True strength isn't about how much damage you can inflict. It's about how much healing you can create after the damage is done. So there you have it. The story of Carmen Reyes, the woman who transformed maximum security prison into her personal battlefield and emerged victorious without ever throwing a punch. But this isn't a story about winning. It's a story about the price of victory and whether revenge can ever truly satisfy the grief that drives it. Think about what Carmen accomplished. She identified her target, infiltrated an impossible environment, dismantled a criminal empire, and destroyed the woman responsible for her son's death. She achieved everything she set out to accomplish with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of someone who understood that true power isn't about force, it's about understanding systems better than the people running them. But here's what makes this story truly haunt me. Carmen entered Riverside as a mother seeking revenge and emerged as something entirely different. Not harder, not more broken, but transformed in ways that most of us can't imagine. She learned that destroying your enemy doesn't heal your wounds. It just creates new wounds that hurt in different ways. The most dangerous thing about Carmen Reyes wasn't her CIA training or her psychological expertise or her ability to see vulnerabilities that others missed. The most dangerous thing was her capacity to transform grief into purpose, pain into strategy, and loss into a precision weapon that operated without violence. She proved that prisons don't just contain physical bodies. They contain entire ecosystems of power, fear, and survival. And someone with the right skills can manipulate those ecosystems more effectively than someone with the biggest fists or the loudest voice. But the real lesson isn't about power or revenge or even justice. The real lesson is about what we become when we are broken. Do we let that brokenness define us? Do we use it as justification for becoming monsters ourselves? Or do we find some way to transform it into something that serves others instead of feeding our own pain? Carmen chose the hardest path. She achieved her revenge, understood its emptiness, and then spent years trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage. She proved that healing isn't about forgetting or moving on. It's about finding purpose in places you never expected to look. And here's what should keep you up at night. How many Carmen Reyeses are out there right now? How many teachers, accountants, nurses, and quiet neighbors have skills and capabilities that you can't imagine? How many people are one tragedy away from becoming something terrifying? How many ordinary people could, if pushed far enough, turn any environment into a weapon? Maybe the most important lesson is that we should treat everyone with the basic dignity and respect they deserve. Not because we fear what they might be capable of, but because cruelty has consequences that ripple outward in ways we can't predict or control. Lucia Vargas made a calculation that destroying Carmen's son would satisfy her need for revenge. She was wrong. The consequences of that decision cascaded through her own life in ways that transformed her from a powerful crime boss into a dying woman who finally understood the cost of her choices. Carmen entered Riverside Women's Correctional to balance scales that the legal system couldn't touch. She achieved that balance, but discovered that true justice isn't about making your enemies suffer. It's about making sure their suffering means something, creates something, prevents future suffering in ways that honor the people who were lost. That's a hard lesson. Most people never learn it. Some people learn it too late. And a few extraordinary people, like Carmen Reyes, learn it in time to transform their lives into something that serves others instead of feeding their own darkness. So remember this story the next time you encounter someone who seems ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. Remember that some people carry oceans of capability beneath calm surfaces. That grief can be transformed into precision weapons that operate without violence. That the most dangerous person in any room is often the one who looks least threatening. And maybe, just maybe, treat everyone you meet with the kindness and respect that acknowledges their full humanity. Because you never know when that ordinary person might be someone extraordinary. Someone who's choosing, every single day, not to use the dangerous skills they possess. Someone who could destroy you if they wanted, but has decided that building is better than breaking. Carmen Reyes was the most dangerous woman in Riverside. But she was also the most humane. And that combination, deadly capability paired with genuine compassion, is something that should inspire us all to be better than our worst impulses. The silent queen of Cell Block C taught us that true power isn't about domination. It's about understanding. And true justice isn't about revenge. It's about transformation. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're inside prison walls or navigating the complex systems of the outside world.